Hello, family. Welcome to week 3 of our Bible study series on Jesus' messages to the seven churches of Revelation. Lord, keep us burning. And I pray that this week again, we're going to have ears to hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches as we look at Jesus' letter to the church at Smyrna. And I think a lot of us, if not all of us, are going to find this message particularly relatable for the very good reason that we all know what it is to suffer. If you've ever been, or maybe even are, in a place where you're thinking, I don't know how much more of this I can take, I don't know how much more I can endure. If you've ever been in a place where you felt numb to everything because you've just been in the same merry-go-round of pain for so long, it's like you're used to getting pummeled. You're really going to be able to relate to this church and what they were experiencing. And as always, the words, the comfort, and the power of what Jesus says to them are going to be just as applicable to your life today. And I believe that as we go forward, you're going to be strengthened in God. Our text is Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, this is what the first and the last says, who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who call themselves Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of the things which you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, so that you may be tested, and you will experience affliction 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. The one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will never be harmed by the second death. One of the first things you notice about this church is that they were in a really, really difficult place. In verse 9, at the very beginning of the message, Jesus says that he knows their affliction and their poverty. He says that they've endured slander from people who were basically inspired by Satan. They're about to suffer even more for 10 days, and the devil is the one who's going to be afflicting them with this testing period that they're about to enter. And it's possible that some of them may even die. So they're in a very, very difficult place. This is a suffering church, and they're demonstrating loyalty and faithfulness to Jesus. But we know what suffering is. We haven't suffered persecution yet as a nation, thank God for that. But we do know what it's like to be in the same place for a long time. Because what you have to notice is that Jesus says, I know your affliction. So he's speaking of a place that they're presently in. They are presently being afflicted. They are presently in a state of poverty, and they are presently enduring slander from the synagogue of Satan. And on top of what they're already enduring, Jesus says that they are about to suffer more. In other words, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And you and I similarly often find ourselves in places where you've been there for so long, you can't imagine how it can get worse, but then lo and behold, it does. And you feel almost numb to everything. You're not quite sure how much more that you can take. Well, you're in good company if that's where you are, or if you've ever been there, because the Smyrnans were in exactly that place. And that is exactly the heart condition that Jesus is speaking to so tenderly and so encouragingly in this message. The way Jesus introduces himself to the Smyrnans really demonstrates his love and his tenderness toward them. He says, this is what the first and the last says. The first and the last. And we talked about in week 1 how the title first and last is not a statement about eternality, the fact that Jesus has always existed and will always exist. It's talking about his sovereignty as God. He is the bookend of God's plan of salvation. He is the beginning and the end of God's intentions for history. He is the commencement and the fulfillment of all God's plans for the cosmos. He is the sovereign Lord of history. Nothing is out of his control. Nothing happens outside of his awareness and outside of his say-so. And then he reminds them that he is the one who was dead and came to life. He is the conqueror of death. Now, if you are in a community that isn't sure how much more it can take, you're wondering how much longer you're going to be around, your Lord and Savior reminding you that He's the one who conquered death is going to be a very, very comforting greeting. To be reminded that He is in control, that He sees and knows everything you're facing, everything you're feeling, that He has not allowed your life to slip through His fingers, that the devil is on a very tight leash with you, and even though he might be raging at the moment, he cannot change the reality that the Jesus who loves you is the sovereign Lord and conqueror of all history, and your life is in his hands. In verse 9, Jesus gives very high praise to the Smyrna church. When he says, I know your affliction, that tells us that they are enduring persecution for his name's sake. But then he says, not only that he knows their affliction, but he knows their poverty. Now, the reason why their poverty is an important concept is because in those days, and especially considering the kind of people that made up the bulk of the early church, if you were an artisan or a person who worked with their hands, you wanted to join a trade guild because, like a union today, if you joined a trade guild, say for carpenters or for metal workers or anything of the sort, you were guaranteed work. You would have credibility behind your name. You would have the backing and support of the guild behind you. But the problem was trade guilds all had patron deities, and you had to show loyalty to that deity if you wanted to join and get rights as a member of the guild. But if you are a Christian, if you are a born again believer in Jesus Christ, you can only give your allegiance to one God. You have only given your allegiance to one God, and you cannot share your heart, even for financial security. You cannot share your heart with anybody or anything else. And so the poverty that Jesus speaks of here is specific to people who had opportunity to live well financially. They could have made life very easy for themselves. If they had just given into a little bit of corruption or a little bit of compromise, they could have made themselves very comfortable. And in the first century world, that was a very big temptation to give into. In Judea alone, where Jesus walked the earth, it's estimated that about 80 to 85% of your yearly income went to food alone. So imagine if 80 to 85% of your annual income was needed just to feed your family, and the other 15 to 20% is what you have left to live off of for all your other needs. So this church made incredible sacrifice for the name of Jesus and denied themselves a good life because they knew what real riches are. Now, about the matter of slander, the slander that they're facing from the so called Jews who are actually a synagogue of Satan, Jesus is not saying that they're not actually Jewish as far as their heritage is concerned. What he's saying is that they are not the true people of God. Because the slander that's going on here is basically libel. Jews were exempt from emperor worship because they were monotheists and because Judea was a very difficult place to keep a handle on, and because early on, when the Roman Empire was rising and it was branching out, some of the treaties that were established between the Jews and the Romans involved them not having to give in to emperor worship because they were strictly monotheistic. And so it was kind of this, well, just pay your taxes and don't make trouble, and you can worship whatever gods you want. And it was kind of a live and let live situation. Now, for a long time, Christians were considered a sect of Judaism. And because they were a sect of Judaism, they were also exempt from emperor worship. And so they would not be arrested or fined for not giving in. But now the Jews in the city of Smyrna begin libeling, begin slandering the Christian community, basically saying Christians are not Jews. And so what that means is they are not exempt from emperor worship. They have to worship the emperor. They don't fall under that provision that the empire has made for us. And so now they start getting in trouble with the Roman authorities. And so the Christians at Smyrna had a decision to make. They're now stuck in the middle. Rome doesn't like them, the Jews don't like them. They're hanging in between the two worlds as a people who simply don't belong. They're hated by both sides, and now they don't have protection at all. And so Jesus is praising them for the fact that they are standing and they are being faithful to Him despite what they are dealing with. You actually see here, in some sense, especially with respect to the poverty issue, this is even a setup for what will later be presented as the mark of the beast, 666, later on in the book of Revelation. Because the mark of the beast was about not being able to buy or sell without having that mark in your right hand or forehead. And this is basically what you would call a false Shema. Now, the Shema comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, where it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And then God commands them to write those things on their hand and on their forehead. And so now, in Revelation, this dragon comes along. He raises up this beast as his representative, and this beast calls the whole world to bear his mark of allegiance or loyalty on their right hand or forehead. And if they don't, they cannot buy or sell. So, really, in the book of Revelation as a whole, and especially here in this message, the whole matter, whether you're talking about the slander and the libel, or you're talking about the poverty and the refusal to join the trade guilds, you are dealing with tests of loyalty for the church. Where do their affections and their allegiances truly lie? That is the core issue. And Smyrna was proving over and over again that their loyalty belonged exclusively to Christ. Now, in speaking to them, you would think that Jesus is going to ride in on his white horse like a knight in shining armor and declare to the suffering church, starting in verse 10, that I'm going to deliver you and I'm going to lay all your enemies at your feet. You will be vindicated in the presence of those who have persecuted you. But no, he actually says, do not be afraid of the things which you are about to suffer. In other words, he is going to permit what they're already experiencing to intensify. And more than likely, this is referring to the libel of the Jews. The Romans have received the words of their Jewish slanderers and are saying to themselves, you know what, these Christians are not Jews. They are not exempt from the worship of our emperor. So we're going to have to do something about this. And so behind the coming Roman persecution is the devil. And it is fair for us to say that the devil is always the animator of the persecution of God's people, from things as extreme as radical Islam or other radical religions threatening death to those who refuse to renounce Christ, or wicked governments threatening death and imprisonment to those who refuse to announce Christ, all the way to things as mild as refusing job promotions to Christian employees who will not compromise their integrity or joke like everybody else. The devil is always behind the persecution of the people of God because he hates God and he hates everything that loves God and represents him. And so rather than delivering them from their suffering, Jesus is going to permit the devil to test them by throwing them into prison. Now, that's not an easy cup of medicine to swallow. That they're already passing the test by my judgment, at least. I would think anybody would read verses 8 through 9 and think, wow, what a church, what a people, what a community. But Jesus says, no, you're going to be tested further and you will experience affliction for 10 days. Now, it's unclear if this is to be seen as a literal number, a literal 10-day period, or as a symbolic number. Now, it's not a big deal, but it's worth mentioning. If it's a literal number, then it's a week and a half, and it's going to be over. And Jesus is comforting them with an actual timetable saying, hey, this is not going to get out of hand. I am your I am your sovereign conqueror, and I'm telling you that this is coming, but I'm limiting the days. It will not last long, I promise you, and all will be well. So it could have just been a literal week and a half period. Numbers and Revelation are the vast majority of the time symbolic. So this would be perhaps the only or one of the only times it's a literal number, but that's neither here nor there. If it's symbolic, 10 is very frequent in the Bible, as a number of judgment, whether that's positive or negative. And it's not that Jesus is saying that he's judging the church. Not in a negative sense, but one of the functions of God's judgment is to manifest and make a distinction between the righteous and the wicked. Paul speaks about how the persecutors of the church heap up damnation against their souls, and when they see the church enduring persecution and not backing down and being courageous in the face of suffering, that is actually a sign to them of their own judgment they're going to fall under before God someday. And an example of 10 being symbolic, you have the 10 plagues of Egypt, you have the 10 commandments. So those two examples right there of God's judgment moving in a positive way with the 10 commandments, the giving of the law, and his judgment moving in a negative way, pouring out wrath upon Egypt. Another example, Israel tempted God 10 times in the wilderness before he finally cut off that generation from entering the promised land. So 10 is very often a symbolic number of judgment, whether it is moving in a manifestation of righteousness or one of dealing with evil. So either way, those are two possibilities of the 10-day period. Let's look at the promise of victory. In the latter half of verse 10, Jesus says, be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, you don't often hear talk like that if you go to a conference on finding the will of God or understanding your destiny. Jesus is basically saying to some of the Smyrnans, this is your destiny in some cases. Some of you are going to be called upon to give your life for me. But if you are faithful, even to the point of death, I will give you the crown of life. Now, they're being compared to runners in a race because Smyrna was famous for its athletic games. So they were famous for their athletic games. So Jesus is even calling them to think about an event that they're very familiar with. He says, if you're faithful until death. So he's talking about spiritual endurance. If you endure for my namesake and you are faithful and don't let go of your commitment to me, even if it costs you your life, I will give you the crown of life. I will give you my victory that I won over death. You will become a full partaker of that, the crown of life. And he says in verse 11, the one who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will never be harmed by the second death. The second death is the resurrection of the wicked. It is where the wicked are given their immortal bodies, because Revelation says that both the righteous and the wicked will be given new bodies, and those new bodies will spend eternity existing somewhere, whether in the eternal bliss of God's presence in the new heavens and the new earth, or if it is in the eternal torment of the lake of fire, which is basically the full manifestation of God's wrath against evil. It is basically the totality of his judgment wrapped up in a location. Satan and his angels will be there. The beast and the false prophet will be there. And all who reject the Lamb, all who reject Christ, will be there as well. And so, Jesus, of all the encouragements and promises he could give to the Smyrnans, this is certainly the most appropriate. He says, the one who conquers what? Well, the one who conquers their suffering. If you will not use your pain as a justification for sin, if you will not use your pain as a license to let go and allow a little bit of compromise into your life, if you will remain faithful to me and conquer, you will not be harmed by the second death. You will be a partaker of the first resurrection, the resurrection of the righteous, and you will be raised to life to exist eternally with me in my kingdom, and you will reign by my side. Let's wrap up our study of this passage with a couple of key takeaways that we want to allow to shape our thinking and shape our faith. First of all, Jesus often expresses his power through compassion, not deliverance. And again, this is hard medicine to swallow. The church at Smyrna was already suffering, and Jesus speaks to them. And rather than telling them that it's almost over, rather than telling them he's going to get them out of it, he's going to, break the back of the enemy and cut off all his attacks, he actually tells them that things are going to intensify. Now, that is not to be understood as some prophetic word that your problem specifically is going to intensify. I don't know that. That's up to God. He's sovereign over your life and he loves you. So whatever he allows to happen, it will be for your infinite good. The thing that I do feel we need to understand is that very often the way that Jesus expresses his power to us is not by coming and delivering us, riding in on a white horse and saving the day, but very often it's by simply showing up and reminding us that he loves us, that he sees us, that he's aware of what we're going through, that he's sovereign, the first and the last. He's in control. He conquered the grave. All of our enemies will be laid under his feet and ultimately under ours as well. And that's why we can keep going, regardless of what we're called to carry. The second thought that we need to consider is that when we look at the New Testament, for all that it says about suffering, it is filled with exhortation, but never with explanation. The Bible really doesn't offer answers on why we suffer and why we go through what we go through. It simply tells us that suffering is a reality, but there's a greater reality, a transcendent reality, and it's God, his love for us, and his empowerment to us in the midst of our suffering. Jesus does not promise us answers in our seasons of difficulty, but he does promise us his power. Think about James chapter 1, where he actually commands the church to count it all joy when you enter seasons of trial and difficulty. Why? Because the trial of your faith produces endurance, and endurance ultimately leads to a Christianity that's whole and perfect and powerful. And that's God's ultimate goal when he allows us to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He doesn't promise us answers. We're not going to get explanations on this side of eternity to every scar we've ever received. We're not always going to look back and have 20/20 hindsight and understand why we went through what we did. And certainly in the midst of it, very rarely do we have those moments of clarity where everything makes sense. They're wonderful when they come, but they don't always happen because God hasn't promised those things to us. What he has promised is empowerment. Just like he gave to the Smyrnans, he said, remember who I am. Remember my victory that I won on the cross. Remember the love that I have for you. Keep on running. Think like an athlete. Think like a racer. And you're going to get to the end. You're going to cross the finish line and receive the crown of life. You will not be hurt by the second death. He doesn't promise us answers in our suffering, but he does promise us his power. For our final point, we need to land on a note that isn't necessarily about us. Now, these first 2 points are good reminders for us of how loved we are. They are reminders for us that the power of God is always available to us. But for the nature of this passage, for what it says, and for our need to be honest about it and face it and let it examine our hearts, this is what I feel is the best point for us to conclude on. It's that Jesus is worthy of full ownership of our lives and has promised us a reward he doesn't owe us. He makes these incredible promises at the end of every one of the messages. He says to whoever overcomes, this is the reward that they're going to receive. Why do we get rewarded at all? I mean, what does Jesus owe us? Why on earth, why in heaven's name should he look at us and say, well done, good and faithful servant? Why are we going to hear those words? Why does Jesus reward us when we really don't contribute a blasted thing to his kingdom? What do we add to God? I mean, really, even if I endure the most intense suffering of my life, what contribution am I making in the light of his vastness and the light of his power in the light of his beauty. What does my suffering contribute to the kingdom? Really? Nothing. Really, that it doesn't. What matters is Christ's suffering. Only the suffering of Jesus ever truly changed the world. And yet he looks at us in our weak, beggarly state, and he says, if you endure like I endured, I'm going to give you a reward, just as I gave my son a reward. He doesn't owe us that, but it's because he's that good and he's that generous and he's that wonderful that he actually gives more to us when it should be us giving more to him. You know, I remember hearing a sermon my goodness, a long time ago, over a decade ago. I first heard it, I guess. It was called 10 Shekels and a Shirt by a man named Paris Whitehead. You can find it online. Um, it's a very convicting sermon, very compelling. And he is basically condemning the way that we tend to preach the gospel as though it's rather humanistic. Come to Jesus so you can have joy and fulfillment and peace and etc. You can feel loved and have a sense of worth. And as true as those things are, he says, you should be preaching that people must come to Jesus because he is worthy and he deserves their loyalty and their worship. And they are idolaters and sinners for depriving him of that worship. And so he is basically calling us back to the real problem that the gospel is meant to deal with. And it's a good message. You know, from what I can remember, it's predominantly a good message, but I do also remember this rather disappointing moment of imbalance at the end of the message. And I think it's appropriate to bring it up here because he says, you should all be saying, Jesus, I'm going to serve you with my whole life, even if I end up going to hell at the end of it. Now, you might hear that statement and already be squirming a little bit because, like, whoa. Now, you could take that statement in one of two ways. You know, you could argue that, gosh, we are just that cynical. You know, I should be just that cynical or that selfish. You know, if it weren't for the promise of heaven, would we serve him? If it weren't for the promise of eternal life, would we follow Christ and live a life of loyalty to him? Or you could take it in another direction, which I think is better and which I do think is right, because I don't think that other option is healthy. I don't think it's the way God thinks, so it shouldn't be the way that we think. The other direction you could take that statement is that, wow, God is just that generous. He doesn't owe us heaven. He has simply promised it to us because he's that good. And in that sense, I think yes, this is reward. It's not wrong to think of this in terms of reward, but more importantly, I think the language of Revelation is this is not about reward, it's about marriage. God has chosen to marry us to himself through Christ. And because we are his bride, we are getting a full share in his estate, in his household, in the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem. It's not that we're being rewarded. We're receiving our new marital status in him. We will have earned nothing, but we will have received everything. It's being freely lavished upon us because the God of the universe is in love with us. And I can't wrap my mind around why. But if that doesn't remind us of his worth, if that doesn't remind us of his beauty and his majesty, and if that doesn't stir our hearts to want to give him everything, I don't know what will. You might be facing a lot right now. I'm quite positive that everybody watching this is carrying some kind of burden that maybe you're feeling numb to it. Maybe you're really wondering how much more of it you can take. And sometimes Jesus comes to us in those moments and he does deliver and he sets free and he opens the prison door and leads us out in glory. But then there are other times he comes, he just puts a hand on our shoulder and he says, it's not over yet, but just remember who I am. Remember how I feel about you. Remember that I'm with you and that you win in the end. And he shows us that compassion that just empowers us and keeps us going. And sometimes the most healthful thing that Jesus can do for us as his children is to remind us of who he is and call us to live for a higher goal than a better tomorrow, but to live for a glorious eternity.